Okay, let's continue with our diversity forum here on stage 2 at Sustainability Live London 2023. Warm hello to all our viewers who are joining us or streaming all the sessions today all over the world, so it's not just everyone here in the room. Okay, so we are looking at the Diversity Forum. We've got a fantastic panel to, as we were just talking behind the scenes there, the how, the what and the why. We're going to cover everything here today, and we've got a very well-positioned panel to do that. So starting on the far end, we welcome back Ash Mukherjee, Solution Partner at Forrester, of course, joined us for a fantastic keynote yesterday, where he came up with the brilliant expression, if you don't have to be a penguin to follow him. You had to be there. It did make sense. Also joining us is Huang, Head of ESG at Bradstreet, and closest to me we have Dolapo Adeboye, Doctoral Researcher from Loughborough University. So warm welcome to all of them, please. Okay, diversity is a huge subject, and we've got a decent chunk of time to dig into this. So we'll start with some of the key strategies to build diverse and inclusive workspace. And Dolapo, we'll start with you about what some of those strategies are. What are your favourites? What do you feel are the biggest winners on that area?
Thank you. So looking at it from a strategy perspective, I would be, organizations would be looking at it from an internal and also an external strategy, and how the approach will be for an internal strategy will be looking at the employment life cycle for their employees. So right from a strategy as in how do they have a resource pool or an employment base that has, that caters to DE&I, and that would be, having the policies to say this is the target, this is what we're looking to achieve, and then look at it from a recruitment perspective, the training and awareness. So it's all that digging down from a strategy, going down to the procedure and policies. And then looking at it also from an external is how do we brand ourselves? And I was looking at something on LinkedIn, I think it was in April of this year, and LinkedIn has a new search, feature that allows, job seekers to actually, filter roles or jobs or, based on, organizations that have their own values. And this will be, from a DEI or from a work-life balance. So putting that out on your website, so from how do we reach and brand and market ourselves, and that is a win-win in terms of a strategy. And the last bit I was looking at from an external strategy will be how we engage with the community. And you find that in the tech space, which I've had experience in, where you have, women in tech, girls in tech, or in STEM. Those are investments, a strategy to be able to, have that diverse pool and attract, a more diverse or inclusive workforce. Thank you.
So it's a real 360
it
view
is
to make it actually effective.
Definitely.
Ash, I'll come to you next on that. So the why you'd want to actually put these strategies in place, really.
Absolutely, with pleasure. And thank you for assembling such a great panel. I mean, we're just the poster child for the United Colours of Benetton. They're not sponsoring this program, are they? So why should you care? And the reason for that is that in much of the discussions today and yesterday, there was a lot of talk about AI and technology being a double-edged sword. Now, for diversity, what I've come across is a particular thing which I think can be a double-edged superpower that can work both for organizations and their leaders, as well as the people of a diverse background. So that superpower is cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence is basically our ability to recognize that there are many ways of doing things. People with high CQ, cultural intelligence, typically are a lot more curious, adaptive, agile, flexible, opportunistic in benefiting from plural opportunities. And what's very interesting is that people of a diverse background, they've often had to do all these things and adapting, adjusting, thriving in sometimes contrarian environments. So it's part of their natural workout, if you like, right? And we've interestingly seen in our research at Forrester And we write a lot also about cultural intelligence alongside, the other factors of intelligence like IQ, your rational intelligence, EQ, the interpersonal intelligence, and RQ, the ability to use robotics technology for organizational outcomes. Cultural intelligence is the ring that binds them all, because it is a tremendous marker, by the way, of leadership quality. We did research with many organizations where we saw that better leaders, more senior leaders, more profit-making leaders were similarly much more opportunistic, much more adaptive, much more agile. And that is the brilliant link as to how people, perhaps of a DI background, typically have these more often because they've had to adjust, adapt in order to thrive. And leaders who have that as well, they are great business leaders. That's why, really, I think, because of cultural intelligence, DI matters to organizations. And I've had some fascinating stories, which I can share afterwards, of actual clients who've benefited from it in real terms.
And I will come to you in just a moment, but I do want to just stay with cultural intelligence for a second, Ash, because I like to read a room if I can. And when you said cultural intelligence, I saw a lot of pens start moving. So if pens start moving, it's often best just to dig into that subject just a little more. So just bear with me, Anne, if you can.
Yeah.
Well, for you, is there enough publicity about that term, about that?
No, unfortunately not. And if there is, sometimes a lot of it, as I'm afraid a lot of the DE&I conversation also is, it can be very superficial and very pedestrian. It's all about shapes, sizes, and shades, perhaps. I think if we can elevate the diversity conversation to intellectual diversity as well, because often a lot of these physical markers that we talk about can be associated or lead up to some of those intellectual markers. In everything that we've been discussing over the last 2 days, around sustainability, that in itself, by the way, is a massive diversity driver. Our conventional business leaders, all they care about is profit, profitability, and growth. Who cares about the planet? Now, if you come up with waving the planet flag, you're already diverse. So how are you going to make yourself heard? How are you going to have a voice at the table that we need to care for the planet, that don't just put you off as a tree hugger? And that is what the cultural intelligence actually does, is that the more adaptive organizations, the better leaders will be doing that. And I know, Anne, you're going to be talking a lot about measures. There's a brilliant organization, Reflexive. They create stock indices of organizations that are actually adapting DEI as much as they're also doing ESG. And what they're seeing is that those organizations who are doing these things, they're actually performing much better on their in their stock performance. So the conclusion for me actually is when you're doing good things, chances are you're doing good things on a number of different factors. So there's a massive correlation between doing stuff like DEI and ESG alongside whatever else you're doing in business. Because what we've seen in the global financial crisis, for example, just driving profit and profitability alone drives all sorts of dodgy behaviors. So we're in the right balanced approach, then you're really onto a winner. And this, by the way, for example, we've seen that for organizations, again, speaking of stock indices, people like the Unilevers, who've been around for decades or not centuries, Procter & Gamble, they have been continuously adapting. I think Procter & Gamble, they used to make candles at some point, right? Look where they are now. If they'd only stuck to, we need to be profitable about candles, or like Kodak was with cameras, or Sony with whatever phones maybe, where would these businesses be? They've got to adapt. Adaptiveness is the biggest thing, and diversity is a tremendous accelerator for that adaptiveness.
Okay, and we will bring you in now. I do apologise, but it seemed to be needed to dig into that a little bit more. So we've been talking about some of the strategies to build a diverse and inclusive workplace. That's part of the battle. I guess part of it as well is how you go about measuring it, because if you can't measure how effective they are, you've got no idea if it's working. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, as a disclaimer, I've never worked in in-house diversity roles, but I've always worked in a third-party sustainability assessment role. So, we look at different companies, look, at how they measure diversity, and my experience is a little bit wider in the full ESG or sustainability aspect. But when we're trying to look at a company, we try to, go with that 360 kind of approach that you mentioned. So we want to look at, their policies, and then, if there's targets or quantitative targets, that would be much better. And then what are some of the actions and procedures they actually put in place to reach those targets? And then, of course, the reporting aspect, how they measure and whether that reporting, the figures, do they actually look back to the targets? Do they need to change it? So it is a management kind of system cycle that all companies need to kind of pretty much rotate every year. So we do want to look at these 360 aspect. And I think a question that came up or from my previous experience is that I was developing a product and we're trying to measure diversity, like the KPIs, and we realized it's really hard to decide what is a good KPI or not, because often we want to compare to our peers in the same sector. And then my previous company, we were developing this for our clients, but we're testing out ourselves, and we realized when we were comparing us and our peers, the KPIs, our KPIs are terrible. But our peers, they actually started on this diversity journey for 15 years, talk about it in their CSR report. But we only started 2 years ago, and we already made good progress. How do we compare us to our peers? So I'm really interested when we get to the KPI question about how you kind of see it from an organizational point of view, not just looking at KPIs, but really genuinely have the employees engage, feel that they're part of it, and not just diversity posters that we tend to see a lot on, coffee, cafeteria areas, instead of, actually genuinely felt by the employees.
And that's a really good question, if you don't mind me jumping in there. And one of the research I'm doing from my, obviously, doctoral research is around focusing on MNCs, so multinational corporations, and for looking at their supply chain and how they address their ESG issues. And obviously one of the issues is around the social, which looks at, DEI, and looking at how they actually, can measure, their performance or, their progress towards their DEI targets. And it was really looking that there needs to be a baseline. And, then the question is, how do they set a baseline? And it has to be a trusted means. So there are, approaches around, engaging third parties so that employees have that trusted platform to be able to, provide their views and their, opinions around, what they're, around DEI for in their organizations, which sets the baseline. Now, as we all know, when you look at DEI, the D, which is diversity, is a numbers game. So it's around, how many do you have? But then it shouldn't stop there when you're setting your KPIs. What you're really going to measure is around, obviously, inclusion. And you have research showing that until an organization has up to 30% of their, underrepresented groups within the organizations having a voice, being inclusive in terms of their procedure, in terms of their decisions in the organization, that is where you're hitting that mark in inclusion. So it's not just enough to say we've got this number of, diverse around, racial or around gender. No, it is stepping the notch and going to KPIs that actually measure in terms of inclusivity, and also looking at the opportunities. So that's looking at how equitable in terms of the opportunities and the, platforms that they made available to, their employees. So I would actually really, that would be highly suggested. Thank you.
One thing I did want to look at before we move on from the measurement of effectiveness is where can people often make mistakes when it comes to trying to measure their effectiveness or build a policy in the first place? And I'll put this out to all of you. What are the common mistakes? Because it's not necessarily an easy process.
Dolapo, go for it.
I'll just jump in there again, if that's all right. I think one of the so as we all know, there is all that buzzword around DEI, but I think the common mistake starts with 101 of DEI, which is education and awareness. And what you find is that there is, and it's we all have different upbringing, and backgrounds, and that's not an issue. That's, it's not bad, or it's not, has no right or wrong, approach to it. But then it is those biases that we have unconsciously, and being able to have an education around that. And when you look at that, and for me, I think that's one of the most critical things to address. It is the foundation, it is the basics that needs to be addressed, and it's addressing that in two perspectives. It is looking at it from one, it's not, for organizations, and I've worked in, global organizations where you have, an outlined, training program. We've all been through that 1 hour that you need to log on, and then you're looking at your phone, and then you wait, and it's an hour, and then you've, fast forward, and that's not what's going to do it. It is a training that is, yes, you've got that formal, but experiential training. And when I look at experiential training, what I'm looking at is where you have, opportunities for organizations where you have, for example, one of the organizations that I've, currently worked with, there was a program called The Future of Work. And what it was is we looked at this is our DEI strategy, and we said, okay, what are the objectives, or what are those, short-term objectives that we want to achieve? And we broke that down into projects, and so we engaged employees to actually get on that project and actually support, and that became part of that awareness. And as they got into it, I remember there was someone who was talking in one of the projects and was saying, what DEI meant to them is that they can come to work and join a meeting without having to talk in a particular way, and I don't have to speak in a particular way to be listened to or to feel confident about myself. So again, it is that education. It is not just that formal education. And what we find, for myself, education is not one perspective, and which is what we've had traditionally. You have an education, it comes, either from Europe or America, so there is a training program that is based from a political set. But no, you're looking at open source education on DEI, so you have all that rounded, perspective around, setting that, helping people to overcome those biases. And I think that is really fundamental to be able to overcome the challenges once you've done that. And it's a continuous process. It is, being able to encourage also employees and encourage leadership to also self-learn. So it's not, for example, waiting for someone to come and tell them, how did I recall meeting someone who said, how do you, because, how, what's your experience, and, how is it for a young girl in West Africa? What's their lives? And I thought, that's just me. I'm one person who's come from West Africa, but there's 17 countries, there are billions of people. My views will not represent all of the people or all the young girls. And so it is being able to encourage people to self-learn and not just obviously dependent on that. So again, just to recap, it's having that awareness education, encouraging self-learn, and experiential learning. Thank you.
Can I add on to that, Dolapo?
Sure.
I think what you've described, I think these are some of the really important entry-level requirements for organizations to understand some of the mechanics and foundations around creating basic awareness of actually what does our D&I picture actually look like.
Absolutely.
But then there's a question of, so what? So what are we trying to do with it? So what do we want to be? So how diverse do we want to be? So what does diversity even mean? So what does inclusion mean? And I think it would be well-serving for organizations and leaders to actually think about those questions as well, in answer to your question, which is like, what's the big mistake? I think organizations don't often sufficiently think through what the real import of diversity and inclusion could actually mean for a business. And that is the real prize, because what we know 100% is that business, more so than ever before, we use the acronym VUCA. Do you guys know what VUCA means? Do you want to explain that?
Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Perfect. Did everybody hear that? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's the world we're operating in. We've got no idea what's going to hit us. Economically, technologically, environmentally, there's a whole maelstrom of things. And what's very curious is that the leaders we have in the organization, and I maybe will speak about that, I think many leaders have got a real handicap because they've gone or developed into their positions in the old days. in their careers which were not in the ways of the future. So that is already a positional handicap, number one. Number two, I think many leaders that we have in place right now, they come from a certain background of privilege. Certainly, maybe up to 2 decades ago in England and in the UK, they might have gone to certain schools, they might have been members of the certain clubs, they might have had a certain color, whatever. And these things mean that they're probably going to be a bit low on my CQ factor, right? Because people who've only speak one language, they've only lived in one country, who've only encountered one sector, they've never had to struggle. If you've got a personal trainer, they'll tell you no pain, no gain, right? So similarly, these leaders who've been so comfortable thanks to their privilege, they are not sufficiently fit for the challenges that the future holds. And DEI can be your best ally, because you can have people who are very curious, adaptive, thriving, opportunistic. In working with them, you can benefit from it. But even better, because not everybody who speaks 2 or 3 languages or who's grown up in different countries, they're not bound to have high CQ, right? I'm not saying that. And similarly, even people who've had what I would call a monocultural background, they may actually also have very high CQ otherwise. And it's overcoming that handicap by thinking about what does it mean for my business? What does it mean for my outcomes? What does it mean for my employees? Because it's very easy to bring in women into leadership roles. But if you're expecting women to behave like men, then you failed. Or if you haven't made arrangements for what else would make women or people, whatever else successful, will be very tricky.
Well, Ash, can I just put a bit of a challenge down to you on that?
Sure.
So say we've got someone in the room today, watching in the audience, who thinks, you know what, I might be that leader. I'm a bit concerned because I don't have that experience. I may have come from a particular background. I acknowledge my own shortcomings there. What would your advice be to them?
You've got a superpower, right? Be conscious of what you bring in and the fact that you're uncomfortable. I'm reading a brilliant book right now. It's called Range, by the way, by David Epstein. Has anybody read that book? Oh, brilliant. Excellent. So in that book, he's talking about the fact that the best learners and people who thrive, they've struggled. And the easier teachers make it for students to learn, the less they remember afterwards. It's a fascinating study. I'm not sure if you've read that chapter. Maybe not. I won't test you, don't worry. So, if you've struggled, that's a really good thing. And that means you know how to overcome your struggle. Okay? If you bring that into business, if you bring that into leadership, then you're on a winner. That's why it's a superpower. And that's why, by the way, it's not about just bringing people into the room, but in fact giving them airtime. Because the voice of reason is unfortunately a lot more silent and quieter than the loud voices in the room, which tend to preoccupy the airwaves typically. So if you hear those voices, and that I think is a very basic definition of diversity and inclusion for me, giving enough airtime to all the voices, because that's where reason and the watchouts are. And those leaders, because that was your question, right? A leader of a DEI background.
Yes, who maybe identifies that they have failings in that area. They may have come from a old school background, if you like, and it's how they can look to address those shortcomings. Okay,
so then work with people of a different background, challenge yourself. That's the only thing that's going to make you fitter.
Yeah,
you can't be just comfortable and kind of in the old ways, because obsolescence and irrelevance is going to be coming your way otherwise.
Yeah, the world has changed. And if we can just continue back to where we were about, we've gone on a slight tangent, about common mistakes. And I guess when people are looking to measure the effectiveness and things, you can get all the data you like about everything. You can say, well, everyone in the business has done this training course and ticked all the boxes. You might have all that data, but it's not of any use. What are the common mistakes people tend to make in that area in terms of measurement?
Yeah, maybe if I start back to your previous question on some of the mistakes on policy.
Sure.
And kind of bouncing back on what you're saying, it's like sometimes the companies that come to us and say like, we want to measure, ESG, sustainability, but they don't know where they're going to yet. So they don't have a policy, or they don't have a certain target they have yet. And so going back to your question, your comments, I think a lot of these companies, they need to take a step back, kind of look at their business first, and set up policies that make sense to the business, not just because like, oh, I need 50% women in management, or 50% women in boards. Does that even make sense? If you're in a company that's very heavily male dominant because it's oil and gas, like it just doesn't make sense. So I think taking time to understand what your business, and then how does that diversity KPI or target is good for your business. I think that's the big, I guess, key point that we haven't really cracked yet with the sustainability agenda, is that we haven't completely fit the, how is sustainability good for my business. I think there's some studies out there. There's some studies of correlation, but not causation, that good sustainability practice is good for the business. Probably the same thing with diversity. I'm curious to read more about that study that you mentioned. So I think that's the first time on the policy side, like where we want to go, and then you need to start to measure and see how monitoring where you're going with it. And then on the KPIs, I think if you're talking to a lot of companies right now, most of their challenges is getting credible data, because there's a lot of self-declared questionnaires, there's a lot of non-financial reports out there that is not certified, not assured. But even if it's assured, you look in the details, you see that, okay, it might be only assured on the carbon part, or it might only be assured on certain regions, like only in Europe. They have no idea what's going on in other parts of the world. So we see a lot of that. So going back to your question on measurement, I think we need to do some fundamental work on building the right type of management system to collect these non-financial data. I think it took all companies a few decades to build the infrastructure of collecting financial data. The accounting system took us quite a few decades to get to IFRS or the US GAAP, for example. But sustainability, we still need to build that infrastructure. But I think the question is, do we have that time? Do we have decades to build all of these measurements, or these collection systems to collect all these non-financial data? That's a big question for all of us, is that if we see the urgency to do so.
Yeah, speaking of questions, I'm already getting a vibe from the room that there will be plenty questions answered. So I will get on to audience questions in just a moment. But one key thing I did want to look at is a real key connector people have when it comes to a business, whether it's through recruitment, hiring, promotions, career progression, any of that, and making sure companies mitigate any bias in doing that, because I'm sure there are plenty of businesses out there who are conscious of that, and they're not wanting, frankly, to get it wrong. What advice would any of you have for how to approach those kind of scenarios?
I think it would probably be a combination of these two things. Get the basics, some of the mechanics, but number two, the motivation. If you've cracked those two factors, then you're onto a winner. And one is absolutely about having the measurements and all of that in place. But even that, as you were talking, and I had to think of a hilarious example and experience I had. So I was working as an advisor to the board for South Africa's largest financial institution. They were doing a major transformation program. You can imagine all of the board was white. I was the only person of color there. And how awkward it was to be in discussions in the board. Like, they were all discussing among themselves, like, oh, we need to have more people of color, and we need to do a lot better on that. This was a few years ago. Things in South Africa have evolved since. And it was slightly awkward. It's like, okay, I'm the only person who's not white here. What do I suggest? Anyway, that wasn't the reason why I was there. The reason I was there was they were doing a large transformation program, and they'd already failed at it once. I was part of the second reset. And I was like, okay, why are they failing? All right. And then we did a personality profiling of this leadership team. And now imagine a spider diagram. You know those cobweb diagrams? What are they called? Spider diagrams.
Yeah.
And each axis is a different personality aptitude. And other than being white, what this team had completely missed out on so far was that the team chart for this team was entirely lopsided. They all had certain personality types, and they loved to hire in more people like them, right? And it didn't matter which color. Maybe even if a black, brown, whatever person would have come in, they might have also still been on the same thing. And guess what? You know, they were all very dynamically red, I think, was the personality color that come up with. So the whole team was very red, and they were very dynamic, proactive, extroverted folks. And they didn't have the analytical, the data-driven, all the other things that you associate with other colors. And then you're thinking, you're wondering, why this program is failing. So, that was a great example, I think, in my personal lived experience about how you could have brought on any number of women and whatever, but you wouldn't have addressed that issue, and that's just as valid. And by the way, from a DE&I background, I think sometimes people of a DI background also have to be conscious that we don't over-adapt to the presumed majority in the room. I think the spirit animal for DEI is a chameleon, in my mind. Not a penguin.
Not a penguin.
I'm bringing in penguins, chameleons, and lemmings, by the way. That's another favorite animal of mine. So don't be a lemming, by the way. Don't just jump onto the DI bandwagon, right? Think about it. So as chameleons, of course, you can't just lose your own color, right? And I don't mean just color. I think everything that makes us a personality. And in the end, it's kind of ironic. Actually, sometimes I wonder, given how many dimensions there are to diversity, at the end of the day, it's almost like everybody is a person of diverse background, right? Regions, education, culture, experience, personal aptitudes and profiles. We're all humans. And guess what? When you have great DEI, you're providing equity to all humans, all inclusion. And then you get through to the talents rather than having exclusive access to some people over others.
And that's a really great, question, and also I really in your comments. And I just wanted to add, I think one great thing is also, or important thing is, where you talk about the why, is organizations really have to ask themselves why. That around recruitment, and do they really want to venture into this place? Because let's face it, it is a vulnerable place for an organization to be in, from a DEI, and it is, as we hear the buzzword, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. But the fact is, it is a very vulnerable place to be in. So it is facing that, organizations and leadership really looking at it and saying to themselves, are we, intentional about recruiting and attracting that diverse, workforce, or that diverse, resource pool. And it is, and the reason I say this is because it has to cut across the employment life cycle. It has to come from how we recruit, and when we have employees in, how do we retain a career growth? And it really has to come to that micro level where you're looking at a career growth for individuals, because when you have an employee who comes in today, their need changes over time. And so being really adaptable to that, do we have that structure? I remember we were having a discussion one of my at work, and we were talking about attracting diverse resource, and someone says, well, we're not going to get people who are neurodiverse, and said, why? I said, because the lighting is all wrong in the office space, and that is something we need to talk about. And I remember also one of the buildings didn't have a ramp, so it is really sitting back to look at it from a ground level up. Are we ready before we actually put ourselves in that position? Sure. And then again, it is being transparent about it. And I know, it is, again, a vulnerable thing for organizations to actually put it on their website to show, we are, inclusive. We are, looking for that diverse, and why we are doing this. And, a lot of research, as you've all said, and again, from a numbers, has shown that, I was looking at an article in Forbes, and it shows that 95% of candidates will actually look at organizations if they have to, roles into organizations and see, what they have on their website around diversity, and look at that as a reason as to actually go after this role or the other. But then again, going back to recruitment, and, it is really being intentional, and that is, once we've come to that stand, or where an organization's come to that, decision around, really attracting a diverse, employee base, then it is, again, we talk about, the awareness, the education, and from a hiring perspective. And one of the reasons why I say this is because when you are in that mode, it is now engaging to ensure that when you are casting your nets out to really attract that pool, it is, having a wider lens from a diverse, perspective. And even with a hiring manager, and even during the recruitment process, in terms of the way those questions or the interview questions are structured, it is to be a lot more mindful, around recruitment. And obviously then moving into retention, around, the promotion process, the calibration process, all those processes have to look at it from a more diverse perspective. So it is end-to-end, again, for a recruitment perspective.
And I'm getting mindful of the time as well, and I appreciate there's going to be questions. Time is running away from us very, very quickly, so we'll go to the room quickly if I can. I believe our first hand was at the front here. If we can keep the questions short and sharp, I'll be very grateful. And if we can try and keep our answers relatively short and sharp, just so we can get as many in as possible. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Akash. My background is a medical doctor, a GP, and I'm also the non-white person on my board for the last 4 years, so I empathise for you, Ash. Regards to the book range, I think it's quite interesting in terms of making that connection of generalism versus specialism and how that relates to DE&I. And just the cogs were just going in my head when you were talking about that cultural awareness, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts were about sort of the promoting sort of generalism as a thing, because I think a lot of people get promoted by being very good at a very narrow field, and then that creates a problem later on. Like you talked about the psychological profile of that board in South Africa. So how do we incorporate generalism in a medical sense? There's always been a devaluation of generalism. The specialist in the big hospital up there who's doing this operation, very specific operation, is top of the food chain, and then the GP sort of up and down the country generally are seen as a lower status. So just interested in your thoughts on that side of things.
Is that for me, Akash?
Oh, well, you and everybody.
Okay. But from our perspective, actually, this question is slightly adjacent to the topic of discussion, because you're talking about generalism and how we drive generalism. It's just like diversity, actually. It's something that we need to be aware of. The whole thing that I'm advocating for is that we know what we have, that we know what we don't have. That's what management and leadership should be beholden to. And just like diversity, we also need to be aware whether or not we're over-specialized. And naturally, the medical industry is characteristic. Actually, it's part of human thinking, right? We tend to go so deep and, come at the elephant from the four legs, sort of whatever that analogy is. And that's what we've got to avoid, that we come at it just so in a specialized way that we have to overcome those things. So know what you do and complement for it.
Okay. Thank you, Ash. We have plenty of hands, so yeah, if we can keep these short and sharp. I think the next one was there, and then we have two at the back.
Hi, thanks for the panel. I just wanted to ask if there's some specific ways in which DEI relates to sustainability, because I think a lot of what we heard so far is very general and applicable to all industries, but just with the mind of the conference that we're at, what can we do in this specific space?
When you're talking about specific space, do you mean different sectors, or what do you? Can you be?
I think it's how we can apply DE&I to the specific sustainability space to enhance that particular area. That's the question? Yeah.
Yes. I think, if you don't mind me jumping in here, I think one of the things important about sustainability is around having it's around adaptability, and what DEI brings is a different perspective. So we are, for example, different organizations having different sustainability goals all around the UN, development goals, and being able to achieve that, you need a diverse workforce that will bring different perspectives onto, to how we can achieve these goals and what methodologies, what technology we can adopt. You need that diverse that will bring innovative thinking. I think that's one of the greatest things that will come, and also from a community perspective, because if you look, especially the EU, obviously we're not part of the EU, but from Europe perspective, one of the things we're looking at is the regulation for CSRD, and I'll be quick, and it is looking at risk and opportunities from internal and also how you impact your community, and you need to have a consciousness around how diverse the community you impact, and that is more effective when yourself as an organization has a diverse employee base. So just
and
keep
Neil,
that short.
Another answer came from this member of the audience here, that diversity is part of the S in ESG. Okay.
Correct.
So good social governance, that's extremely important. Thank you for that suggestion. But also the fact that sustainability considerations, like I was saying earlier on, are a very diverse background to the conventional background of many business leaders, right? So how do we give that some airtime to? That's the link. And we were exploring this question actually in our preparation, Neil.
We were, absolutely.
Actually, can I just add on? I think sustainability, intrinsically, it's probably the most interdisciplinary topic, because if let's just take a concrete example like GHG emission, you need operations to be working on it. You need, finance to kind of convert the emission into certain, dollar signs. You need procurement to be part of it. You need HR to be engaged in employees. So I think inherently sustainability, it is a mission for everybody in the company. And ideally, I think in the world, ideally, there shouldn't be a sustainability department or CSR department anymore, because it should just be inherently ingrained into all business functions.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we had 2 more hands come up. Again, if we can keep these relatively brief, because it is nearly lunchtime and I don't want to riot. So.
Emma Hodges from FRA, where I lead our sustainability program, and I'm a member of our DEI steering committee. Thanks very much to all the panelists. My question is really around where we are now with our DEI initiatives and employee engagement. I know a number of companies have operated, focused on DEI principles for many years, but others perhaps only started this journey in more force, maybe responding to the horrific murder of George Floyd back in May 2020. Among our network, we're certainly hearing that in many organizations, there's a lot of fatigue around driving these DEI initiatives forward now. So curious to understand if that's something that you're experiencing now, because this certainly is the work of all employees in an organization, the self-reflection, learning, awareness, having difficult conversations. This is really work for all individuals to be driving. So there is, I understand, a lot of fatigue around it. Are you observing this? What do you suggest people can do to reinvigorate employees?
100%. Can I just jump in there? Because just as we experienced the green lash, right, against ESG and sustainability stuff, diversity is almost grouped together in a similar category, right? And being woke is such a terrible thing after all, right? If you judge by the media. So I think you've got to lift up the conversation and create a bridging area, which is what are the business outcomes? Are we doing well as a business or not? What's the profit? What's the opportunities that the business is achieving or not achieving? Because my hypothesis is that if you're not good on sustainability, if you're not good on diversity, you're probably not running a really good business. Okay, and you need to find that burning platform to challenge people that no, this does matter by talking about kind of the impact of cultural intelligence with regard to your business outcomes. What is that? So what? That's what you need to grab and ring the alarm bells on, rather than, like I said, just be a tree hugger. So don't do the tree hugging, just talk about the numbers.
And If
but
you
it's
don't
a
mind,
real thing.
and if you don't mind me, just a quick add.
Sure.
Organizations are the best placed to be able to address DEI. I was looking at the UK labour statistics at the half year. So 76% of employable people in the UK are in employment, which is the highest after COVID. But where I'm getting to is we all spend a third of our life in work, and so it is at the workplace that we can address it. Now, you're saying you asked a question around fatigue, and that is something that is a very high risk, and is something that I've observed also as part of my research. And it just goes back to two very basic ground level things. You find 76% of the population going to different places 5 days a week for one objective. The objective is everyone's united to go to their workplace to earn a living. One approach could be organizations including, as part of their incentive in remuneration from leadership right to the lower levels, to be able to encourage them to achieve these strategies by including it part of their performance evaluation and as part of their their remuneration. So it should be something that is incentivized so that employees and in organizations are more encouraged to be able to pursue this, and not just as a good feel factor, but everybody likes to see something coming in their paychecks.
Okay. I think that is all the time we're going to have for. We could carry on with this all afternoon. I
Yes,
feel like
we
we haven't actually scratched the surface. We've considering touching the surface. We've kind of reached that point. But a huge thank you to Anne, to Dolapo, and to Ash.
Thank you. Thank you.